The cathedral was majestic, but the tension within it was unholy. It began with a question, soft-spoken but sharp enough to draw blood. Bishop Robert Barron, seated beneath the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey, faced the most powerful man in the Catholic Church and uttered words no bishop had dared speak aloud in over a century. "Your Holiness, with all due respect, have you not exchanged eternal truth for temporal peace?" The air turned still. Not even the creak of a wooden pew dared interrupt. Across the world, millions watched the live stream. What had been scheduled as an interfaith panel on compassion and doctrine in a changing world had just transformed, irreversibly, into a tribunal of truth. Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pontiff, did not flinch. His robe hung motionless, his hands clasped as if in prayer or preparation. His gaze met Barron's, unblinking, unreadable. This was no mere disagreement between clergy. It was a reckoning. A reckoning that would pit modern reform against sacred tradition. And behind both, the souls of the faithful hung in the balance. The moderator stammered, but the words wouldn't come. The silence inside the abbey was louder than thunder. Viewers leaned forward. Clerics sat rigid. Vatican representatives exchanged looks, their confidence visibly eroding. Bishop Barron didn't back down. His voice was slow, deliberate, shaped by decades of preaching, but sharpened by pain. Truth cannot evolve to survive. It must remain, or it ceases to be truth. And then Pope Leo spoke. His response would not be long. But it would be remembered. Because in the stillness that followed, after his voice left the air and his eyes returned to stillness, there would be no laughter, no applause, no dismissal. Only fear. Only awe. And silence from the Vatican that has lasted to this day. Now ask yourself, if the keeper of truth is accused of twisting it, and the Church says nothing, who, then, will speak? Comment where you're watching from. And if this moment doesn't compel you to subscribe, step into the comments and tell the world why. Because what happens next will test everything you believe. He was hailed as the Pope of the people. Born in a quiet corner of Vermont to a French-Canadian mother and an Irish-American father, Leo Murray was never supposed to ascend beyond the dusty seminary libraries of Montreal. But the boy who once sat under snow-covered pines reading Aquinas by candlelight would, decades later, kneel beneath the ancient dome of St. Peter's Basilica, crowned not with ambition, but with unprecedented expectation. As Pope Leo XIV, he rebranded the Church's voice, softer in tone, broader in embrace, fluent in the language of modern justice. He toured refugee camps before stepping foot in Rome. He issued papal encyclicals that referenced climate science, trauma psychology, and even postmodern ethics. His sermons were laced with tenderness. His theology, some whispered, was laced with risk. To the global South, he was a shepherd of compassion. To secular Western elites, a surprising ally. But to many within the ancient guard, Leo's gospel was a thread being pulled, unraveling truths too sacred to be stretched. And among his quietest yet fiercest critics stood Bishop Robert Barron. Raised in the Midwest, educated at Catholic University, and refined in the scholastic traditions of Oxford and Paris, Barron was not a man of rebellion, but of roots. He wore intellect like armor and wielded doctrine like a scalpel, not to wound, but to heal precisely. On YouTube, his debates dismantled atheism without raising his voice. In cathedrals, his homilies stirred tears without a single performance. He was the mind of Thomas Aquinas wrapped in the heart of a parish priest. He had defended popes in the past. He had avoided scandal. But this time, he could not remain silent. Their paths crossed publicly for the first time on an unseasonably cold spring evening in Westminster Abbey, London. The panel was titled, Bridging Compassion and Truth, Faith in a Fragmented World. On paper, it was a moment of unity. In reality, it was the stage upon which one would question the soul of the other. The world watched. Live streamed to over 120 countries, translated into 14 languages, the Abbey was flooded not with tourists or choirs, but with silence, cameras, and history. Diplomats, cardinals, imams, and scholars filled the pews. Outside, crowds huddled behind barricades, bracing for something no press release had promised. Because while the program suggested dialogue, the Holy Spirit had other plans. This was not a mere exchange of ideas. It was a spiritual confrontation. A theological standoff veiled in civility. And though no one said it aloud, all felt it, something eternal was on trial. When Bishop Barron accused the Pope of trading permanence for popularity, he did not do so in anger. He did so with sorrow, the kind that only grows in men who've carried the weight of silence too long. And Pope Leo? He had been challenged before. But never like this. Never by a voice so calm, yet so immovable. This night would mark the first time in the modern era that the two poles of Catholicism, progress and tradition, met without a filter, without diplomacy, and without retreat. And the Church would never be the same. Subscribe to Circle of God's Glory if truth matters to you. And if you won't, tell us why below. Because this is not just commentary. This is a reckoning. The question was disarmingly simple. Can doctrine, the moderator asked, adjusting his tie with visible discomfort, adapt to the needs of a changing world without losing its soul? There was a pause, not long, but thick. The kind of pause that reminds you the next words might echo for generations. Pope Leo XIV answered first. He didn't look to his notes. He didn't look to the crowd. He looked straight ahead, almost as if speaking not to men, but to history itself. The soul of doctrine, he said, is not in its rigidity, but in its capacity to meet the suffering where they stand. If our theology cannot find its voice in the trauma of a refugee or the shame of a teenager abandoned by their parish, then it is not eternal, it is irrelevant. Polite applause followed, more out of social reflex than conviction. The Abbey's shadows seemed to shift. Bishop Barron sat still. Unmoved. Listening not just to what was said, but to what was avoided. He cleared his throat quietly, and when he finally spoke, it was not in rebuttal, but in reflection. A surgeon, not a swordsman. Your Holiness, he began, voice calm, I agree that doctrine must walk with the wounded. But I fear we are beginning to redefine the wound itself. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The room leaned in. In your apostolic letter last Lent, he continued, you wrote that the Church must make room for stories that challenge what we thought we knew about sin. He paused. That phrase was beautiful. But it was also dangerous. Because if sin is now subject to reinterpretation based on emotion, then grace itself becomes meaningless. And if we do not agree on what wounds us, then how can we ever agree on what heals? Pope Leo nodded once. Slowly. His hands remained clasped. His reply came with the tone of a father correcting his son, not an opponent countering a foe. There is no grace without truth, he said. But truth without empathy becomes a weapon. We must not confuse the defense of doctrine with the denial of presence. The words were careful. Crafted. But behind them, a deeper current churned. Barron's gaze did not drop. But presence must not become permission, Your Holiness. Especially when the souls of the faithful are looking to Rome for clarity, not comfort. The moderator tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, asking about digital evangelism and interfaith unity. But it was too late. The room had shifted. What began as a dialogue had taken the shape of a silent duel, smiles masking suspicion, civility cloaking fire. Every answer now carried a shadow. Every gesture was weighed. Each man knew what this moment truly was, not a discussion about relevance, but a battle over the future shape of orthodoxy. And though no one said it aloud, the question hung above them like incense, had the Church's language changed so much, that even truth was now up for debate? If this makes you think twice, hit subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. If not, we welcome your challenge, comment your take below. Because silence in times like this, is not neutrality. It's consent. The moderator's voice faded into the background. His next question, something about cultural dialogue, went unanswered. Neither man moved. Neither blinked. The room was no longer following a program, it was bearing witness to a fracture. Bishop Barron adjusted the microphone before him, the faint sound of shifting metal echoing louder than it should have in the vaulted stillness of the abbey. With all respect, Holy Father, he began, this isn't about the margins. It's about the message. He reached into the folder before him and produced a slim, cream-colored booklet, Pope Leo's most recent exhortation, Breath of the Wounded Earth. It had received wide praise from media outlets and progressive theologians alike. But to Barron, it was something far more dangerous than innovation. It was erosion. He opened to a marked page. In section 28, Your Holiness writes that moral frameworks must stretch when they meet real suffering. You go on to describe that the Church's role is to accompany before it assesses, to listen before it defines. He looked up, his eyes not unkind, but unyielding. Stretch too far, Barron said, and a framework becomes a fracture. Delay definition too long, and the soul remains lost. There was no applause this time. Only the tension of unspoken agreement, or unspoken dread. Pope Leo leaned forward, his voice gentle but heavy with experience. I met a man in Sydney, he said, once devout, who had been exiled from his parish after confessing he was struggling with his identity. He wept in my arms like a child abandoned. His story was not a debate, it was a plea for dignity. He paused. The silence thickened. I've stood in shelters in Toronto where women, trafficked and tormented, could not quote the Catechism, but they knew the ache of divine absence. Do we deny them the Church because their scars do not fit our system? Or do we go to them, wounded as they are, and say, you are not forgotten? Barron listened. But he did not fold. There is no dignity, he answered, in giving people a reflection of their pain and calling it holiness. Compassion does not require doctrinal confusion. In fact, it demands the opposite. He rose slightly in his chair, not with aggression, but with burden. Holy Father, I speak not of exclusion, but of clarity. A shepherd's voice must be distinct in the storm. And right now, your voice, to many of the faithful, sounds like an echo of the world they're already drowning in. The moderator shifted in his seat. One of the cameras panned silently. Somewhere in the front row, a young seminarian held his breath, knowing he was witnessing something that would shape his priesthood. The Pope's expression did not change. But the gravity in the room told the truth that neither man yet spoke aloud. This was not about a sentence in a book. It was about a shift, a slow, seismic movement beneath the foundation of the Church. And only one question mattered now, was the ground cracking, or being rebuilt? This isn't just a debate. It's a crisis of clarity. Subscribe to Circle of God's Glory if you care about where the Church is headed. Or defend your silence in the comments, but know that silence is not neutral. There are moments in history when time itself seems to halt, not from noise, but from silence. Westminster Abbey was ancient, yes, but it had never been this still. Every stained glass window, every carved saint, every hanging light fixture seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that what was unfolding below would soon outlive even them. Bishop Barron leaned forward, not casually, not dramatically, but as one who had decided that this would be the moment he would no longer defer. Your Holiness, he said, I must ask you plainly, and I pray you hear this without presumption, do you believe that the early Church was wrong? Gasps did not erupt. No one shifted. The shock was not loud, it was paralyzing. Pope Leo did not blink. But the flicker in his eyes betrayed a change. This was not a question posed for sound bites. It was a wound laid bare. Barron was no longer speaking as an intellectual adversary. He was speaking as a son of the same church, begging his father to confirm that their foundation had not been quietly abandoned. Leo answered with precision, but not peace. "I believe," he said, "that the early church was faithful within its world. But we no longer live in theirs. What was once unspoken must now be interpreted. What was once assumed must now be re-examined." His voice didn't tremble. But it no longer comforted. Barron's face tightened, not in anger, but in something deeper. Grief. He spoke again, slowly, as if measuring every syllable against the weight of the Church's millennia. "And when Christ said, 'Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not,' was that also time-bound?" Leo straightened. "The word remains. But its understanding must breathe." Barron did not hesitate. "And in this breath, Your Holiness, are you offering oxygen to the sinner, or smoke to the confused?" There it was. The line not written, not rehearsed, not sharpened in preparation, but born in that very moment from the crushing tension between compassion and conviction. The room did not gasp this time. It fell into a silence so total it felt physical, like the air had turned to glass. No page turned. No foot shifted. Even the cameras seemed to blink more slowly. Pope Leo remained composed, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. He looked not at Barron, but slightly downward, toward the marble floor beneath them, as if consulting a place far older than either of them. He looked back up. "You call it smoke. I call it mercy in a wounded world. Barron, unwavering, and I call it poetic deception. It sounds holy, it feels warm, but it obscures the light. And a confused soul walking in darkness does not need warmth. It needs truth." For a moment, no one breathed. The Abbey's massive cross above the altar loomed silently behind them, its shadow stretching across the floor like a quiet reminder of what had been died for. Because now, the confrontation had shifted. This was no longer about theology. This was a collision between two visions of the Church, one that adapts, and one that anchors. And in the chasm between them stood every soul looking for a voice they could trust. If that moment hit your spirit, subscribe now to Circle of God's Glory. If it didn't, tell us why. But don't leave this unresolved. Because truth, once heard, demands a response. The silence after Barron's last words was not just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something heavier. Something irreversible. Those seated inside Westminster Abbey were no longer mere witnesses to a theological discussion, they were standing at the edge of a spiritual divide. Pope Leo, aware that his every word now echoed far beyond the marble and stone of the cathedral, sat back in his chair, contemplative. But the tension that filled the space no longer allowed for contemplative tones. It demanded answers. He began slowly. "I have walked through hospitals in Adelaide where men were dying without family, judged by their churches, abandoned by their communities. I've heard their last words. Not blasphemies, Bishop, but prayers. Prayers that God would see past their brokenness. That he would remember who they tried to be, not what they had become." The words fell with solemn weight. A few heads in the crowd nodded. Leo pressed on. "If doctrine cannot comfort the dying, it has failed. If it cannot kneel beside the addict, the outcast, the ashamed, then perhaps it is not the gospel we are protecting, but our pride." It was moving. It was human. But it was also evasive. Barron's reply was not loud. It was clear. "Holy Father," he said, "your compassion is real, and I do not question your heart. But emotion cannot replace truth. A doctor who sits beside a dying man and refuses to name the disease out of love, has not practiced mercy. He has participated in death." There were no gasps now. No coughs. Just the raw air of confrontation. Barron leaned forward slightly. Not in aggression, but in revelation. "You speak of hospitals. Let me speak of pulpits. Priests across the world are now unsure whether to preach the cross or apologize for it. Confessors wonder whether sin is still sin. Parents hear your words and ask if they've been too narrow in raising their children. Holiness has become a moving target. He paused. Then, with the deliberate force of a man who knew his words would outlive the moment, doctrine does not oppress the wounded. It defines the wound, so that healing can begin. Without clarity, the church becomes not a refuge, but a fog. Leo inhaled, visibly but quietly, as though collecting the strands of a defense that no longer held. I have only ever wanted, he said, to draw people closer to the mercy of Christ. And in doing so, Barron replied gently, you have sometimes drawn them away from the truth of Christ. Not out of malice, but out of the great temptation of our age, to love without leading. There it was. The dismantling. No raised voice. No accusation of heresy. Just a calm and unshakable drawing back of the veil. Beneath the compassionate vocabulary, Barron had revealed a dangerous theology, one that embraced but did not transform, welcomed but did not warn, soothed but did not sanctify. Faces in the crowd showed it all, frozen expressions, furrowed brows, unease sitting side by side with revelation. A few clergy looked down. A cardinal reached for the beads in his pocket but did not begin to pray. One seminary student, seated at the back, was visibly weeping, not from offense, but from clarity. The moderator, pale and unsure, made no attempt to speak. Because in that room, no clarification was possible. The lines had been drawn. And everyone, whether pope, bishop, or believer, now had to choose where to stand. If you're still watching, you feel it too. Hit subscribe to Circle of God's Glory if you're seeking truth in an age of shadows. Comment if you disagree, we dare you to explain why. Because conviction demands courage. And cowardice wears silence like a robe. The clash had thundered through the halls of Westminster, but now, as the echoes settled, something deeper emerged, not silence, but stillness. Not withdrawal, but reverence. As if even the architecture understood that confrontation without redemption is only half a gospel. Bishop Barron did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply looked down for a moment, as though the weight of his own words had landed fully on his own soul. And when he lifted his eyes again, his tone had changed. It no longer carried the sharpness of rebuke. It carried the tremor of sorrow. Holy Father, he said quietly, I know your heart is not to mislead. I have seen your compassion in action. I do not question your love for the wounded. What I question, is whether that love has begun to forget that truth is its only compass. There was no reply. Not yet. Barron pressed forward, not with accusation now, but with appeal. His voice softened, as if speaking less to a man and more to a brother, or perhaps even to a son who had strayed too far from the shoreline. I fear we are trading eternal clarity for temporary kindness. Trading the narrow path for public applause. But eternity, he said, does not ask us to be liked. It asks us to be faithful. He paused, letting the weight of that word, faithful, hang undisturbed in the room. And then, lifting his gaze to the audience, and beyond them to the invisible congregation watching across continents, he spoke not to Pope Leo, but to the body. To those listening across oceans and cities, from dorm rooms to pulpits, I say this, truth is not cruel. It is costly. And yes, comfort will always feel easier. But comfort does not resurrect. Only truth does. He turned back to Leo, gently. Your Holiness, the Church does not need a new vocabulary. It needs new courage. Not to abandon the wounded, but to lead them, clearly, firmly, lovingly, toward holiness. Because sentiment may fill pews, but only sanctity fills heaven. Leo's face was unreadable. Not defiant. Not ashamed. Something quieter. Like a man caught between the nobility of his intent and the growing awareness of its unintended consequence. Barron continued. The world is watching. Our children are watching. They are asking not only what the Church believes, but whether we believe it still matters. And if we blur the lines to keep their love, we will lose both their love and their souls. His final words came like a prayer, more to the heavens than to the Abbey. What kind of church do we want to be? One that bends so gently it forgets it has bones? Or one that stands, even in the storm, because it knows who built it? The Abbey did not applaud. It wouldn't have been fitting. But something moved. Something ancient and real. Not in volume, but in weight. Even the silence now seemed charged with a sacred grief, and a sliver of hope. Subscribe if you believe the Church still has hope. Comment if you're still unsure, your voice matters here. Because at this hour, neutrality is a myth. And history will remember the ones who chose to speak. And now, the question no panelist could answer, no theologian could dodge, no bishop or pope could fully escape, turns to you. What would you have said if you were in that room? Not as a spectator. Not as a social media voice. But as a soul, flesh and spirit, watching two pillars of the faith collide beneath the gaze of heaven. Would you have defended tradition? Would you have pleaded for reform? Would you have stood in silence, praying one of them was right? Or fearing both of them were wrong? This story was not about winning an argument. It was about unveiling a crisis that has silently grown beneath pulpits and policies for decades. The war between truth and tenderness, between the eternal and the emotional, between what is clear and what is comforting. That war is now public. So we invite you, not as an audience, but as a participant, to reflect, to wrestle, and to speak. Comment your thoughts below. Not with rage. Not with sarcasm. But with reverence. Because the Church does not grow stronger when it is silent, it grows stronger when its people care enough to speak with both fire and humility. And to those who feel the tremor in their spirit. To those who sense that something sacred is being tested, stretched, reshaped. To those who do not want to stand on the sidelines of a wounded church's future. Subscribe. Not for the algorithm. Not for content. Not for numbers. Subscribe because truth still matters. Because courage is still holy. Because history is not shaped by the loudest, but by the faithful. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. Even when it hurts. Especially when it's hard. This is Circle of God's Glory, where truth meets courage. Subscribe. Not for views, but for vision.